right, welcome to the new JFK show number 126. For our audience tonight, we've got a standing ovation presentation. This is Dr. Jim Fetzer in the year 2016, and this was his presentation in Dallas, Texas at the JFK Conference. Dr. Fetzer, we're going to turn it over to you, and this is the state of the JFK research in 2016.
Well, thanks very much, Gary. As I explained on the occasion, the reason understanding the assassination is so complex is because there were many different parties that need to be sorted out or segregated in a certain way. As you see on the first slide, the reason people ask, did the CIA do it? Did the Castro do it? Did the Mafia do it? The Texas Oilmen? Is roughly because it was more or less all of the above. The sponsors of the assassination included the CIA. JFK was threatening to shatter it into 1,000 pieces. The Joint Chiefs, who had decided that JFK was an obstacle after having refused to invade Cuba, contrary to the unanimous recommendation, having signed an above-ground trust ban treaty with the Soviet Union against their unanimous opposition, and now pulling our forces out of Vietnam, where they believed that a stand had to be taken against the expansion of international godless communism. The anti-Castro Cubans wanted revenge for what they believed was their betrayal at the Bay of Pigs. It hadn't actually been JFK's responsibility, but the CIA allowed them to entertain the false belief. The Mafia was upset because Bobby was cracking down on organized crime for the first time in American history. Just as Edgar had sex dossiers on members of the Congress, so, for example, a representative of the agency or even Edgar himself might drop by a senator's office and show the senator photographs of him in bed with a woman other than his wife and explain, Senator, now this information has come to our attention and we want to let you know that we're going to make sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. And as they'd leave, they'd ask the senator to remember the FBI at the time of the next appropriations hearing. But the mob had a sex dossier on Edgar, including compromising photographs of him with his close personal aide, Clyde Tolson, so that they were able to control Edgar, and he was unable to even identify the existence of the Cosa Nostra until after the Joe Valachi hearings, which laid it out in such detail and precision it was no longer politically possible to deny. The Eastern establishment surrounding the Fed were very upset with JFK because he'd already instructed the Department of the Treasury to print hundreds of millions of United States notes on the ground that it was absurd for the government to be paying interest to a consortium of private banks for printing the currency of the United States. The Texas Oilmen, of course, were troubled that he was going to cut the oil depletion allowance, a massive write-off they received on the ground that by pumping oil out of the ground, they were putting themselves out of business. And JFK was at loggerheads with David Ben-Gurion, the founder and first prime minister of Israel, who wanted to develop nuclear weapons, where JFK thought that was a very bad idea. Unquestionably, JFK was right, but in the end, of course, he wasn't able to prevent the inevitable. The mechanics, the shooters, supervisors, and coordinators, who turn out to have included George Herbert Walker Bush and Edward Lansdale, the Air Force general who was responsible for supervising assassinations all over the world, especially in Vietnam, and who appears to have positioned the shooters and determined the shots they took, which we will review as we proceed, where George H.W. Bush appears to have had a special role of supervising a hit team in the Dow Tex building. But the facilitators who made it happen and covered it up were Lyndon Johnson of the assassination and J. Edgar of the cover-up, where Lyndon, of course, as the new president, was able to control the course of events, appointing the Warren Commission as a mechanism for covering up the true causes of the death of our 35th president, and where, in particular, he had put himself in this position by forcing himself on the ticket in Los Angeles in 1960, which is where you have to begin to understand the assassination of JFK, about which I will elaborate in passing. But then in creating the Warren Commission, he made J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, the sole investigative agency. And because of the complicity of the Dallas Police Department, the Dallas Sheriff's Department, the Dallas DA, the FBI, the Secret Service, anyone who actually had information that would be valuable in solving the crime was, unbeknownst to them, in a position of being unable to bring it to any parties who would actually seek to advance the investigation, the revelation of truth, rather than the cover-up itself, as I shall explain. One of the most brilliant books, by the way, to address these issues was published in 1997 by Noel Twyman, Bloody Treason, on the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Noel did a great deal of research on the Zapruder film as well as on the assassination itself, but his book is a masterpiece of studies of the individuals and groups who were involved, or perhaps his most important contribution is reflecting on the general character of the assassination, different combinations with the greatest probability of success, including a combination of the CIA military with the Secret Service, with the Mafia, with LBJ and Hoover. With LBJ and the conspiratorial group, Hoover could be relied upon to fall in line because the Mafia had compromised him. That risk would seem acceptable to the plotters once they had LBJ in their circle. Here's the only part where I think that Noel doesn't have it right, because it was Lyndon who was bringing the parties together. But notice as you proceed down the page, talking about combining the CIA military, the Secret Service, the Mafia, and Lyndon, all the Mafia would have had to do is to get the CIA involved and would have had the CIA recruit the Secret Service and Lyndon. It would have had a perfect conspiracy. Here's the key, however, what actually played out. All Lyndon had to do was recruit the CIA, who would use the Mafia as needed in the Secret Service, and he had a perfect conspiracy. Edgar would fall in line after the fact when confronted with LBJ and the Mafia with blackmail material, except that Hoover appears to have been complicit from the beginning, as I am going to explain. And if this scenario involved any right-wing extremist, it was in the capacity of providing financing for the assassination. Here's a completely brilliant book by Madeline Duncan Brown, with whom I had over 100 conversations. Madeline was a mistress of Lyndon. They began an affair in 1948. She bore him a son, Stephen, in 1950, not his only child out of wedlock, but his only male offspring. Madeline told me a great deal about their relationship, including an event at the home of Clint Murkison, where Lyndon showed up late in the evening. There were many heavy hitters there. Madeline said it was a relatively small event as these go, a couple of dozen people, but it included J. Edgar Hoover. She believed initially he was the guest of honor because Hoover would frequently stop in Dallas en route to California to the Del Mar racetrack, where anytime he put down a bet, his horse would invariably win. That may have been because Clint Murkison Sr. Was the owner of the Del Mar racetrack. Richard Nixon was there. She remembered him having been driven out to the event by a Republican leader who worked in the same bank building where she was a young advertising executive. George Brown and Root Heavy Construction was there. When the Vietnam War went down, Brown and Root received a $1 billion to dredge a new port at Cam Ranh Bay, even though Vietnam has many natural ports, and I'm quite sure one wasn't necessary. John J. McCloy was there. He was our former High Commissioner to Germany, former Chief Executive Officer of Chase Manhattan Bank. And when Lyndon organized the Warren Commission, he would make 2 appointments to the presumptive civilian positions because we had 2 senators Richard Russell and John Sherman Cooper, two members of the House, Hale Boggs and Gerald Ford, and two supposed to be civilians, but he appointed Allen Dulles, the former director of the CIA, whom JFK had removed from office, with great fanfare, of course, and John J. McCloy. So it was very cleverly contrived. He induced Earl Warren to head the commission, although it was completely inappropriate, because had it actually made its way through the criminal process and wound up before the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice was already compromised. Lyndon showed up late in the evening, disappeared into a boardroom with these other heavy hitters. After 15 or 20 minutes, he strode over toward her. She thought he was going to whisper sweet nothings in her ear. Instead, he told her in a hateful tone of voice that after tomorrow he wasn't going to have to put up with those Kennedy boys any longer. That wasn't a threat. That was a promise. 6 weeks later, they had a rendezvous at the Driscoll Hotel in Austin, Texas, on New Year's Eve, where she confronted him with rumors rampant in Dallas at the time that he had been involved since no one stood to gain more personally. He blew up at her and told her the oil boys and the CIA had decided that Jack had to be taken out, which is as close to a confession as we have had in the history of this event. The title, Texas in the Morning, originated from after a night together, Lyndon, with a rice throw, opened the windows to the hotel where the rendezvous took place and bellow out, "God, I love Texas in the morning." The next book of great value is by Billy Saul Estes, who was a wheeler dealer, a con man who made a great deal of money for Lyndon Johnson, John Connally, and their cronies. Billy Saul knew Cliff Carter, Lyndon's chief executive assistant, whom Lyndon sent down to Dallas to make sure all the arrangements were in place for the assassination, and Malcolm Mac Wallace, Lyndon's personal hitman, who murdered a dozen persons, for at least a dozen for Lyndon, including one of his own sisters. Through conversations he had with them both before and after the assassination, he became convinced that they had both been involved. He and Madeline, indeed, were about to commence a kind of a tour of their two books together. It would have been a very potent combination when Madeline passed away, to the best of my knowledge, from natural causes. But in a case like this, that's a hazardous assumption to take for granted. Here's another important book of Bar McClellan, who went to work for Joe Clark, the most powerful attorney in Texas, who was Lyndon's attorney and helped arrange the assassination, helped to plan both the assassination and the cover-up. Whereas I will explain, more effort, I think, was put into the cover-up, even in terms of details, than to the assassination itself, particularly because Edward Lansdale was so skilled at pulling these things off. Also, we have the deathbed confession from E. Howard Hunt, who was not the third of the tramps, though often mistaken for him, but rather described himself as a backbencher. When he thought he was on the verge of death, he gave a list of the chain of command to his son, St. John, with whom I have conversed on several occasions. That would be published as the final confession of E. Howard Hunt in Rolling Stone, where the chain of command, as he conveyed it to St. John, went from Lyndon Johnson to Gord Meyer, then in charge of covert ops for the CIA, to David Atlee Phillips, in charge of CIA Western Hemisphere, to William Harvey, generally in charge of assassinations for the CIA, to David Sanchez Morales, who was another notorious assassin and who even boasted about getting Bobby at the Ambassador Hotel in 1968. If you want more evidence of the complicity of Lyndon, you can get it from Jack Ruby, who, of course, as the owner of the Carousel Club in Dallas, actually turned out to be the local arrangements chairman for the mob with regard to the assassination. It was a skyrocketing number of phone calls coming from mobsters to Jack Ruby at the club. After he was indicted for the shooting of Jack Ruby, though we have done shows now that cast doubt on whether, in fact, Jack himself actually fired the shots, he had interchanges with reporters in which he explained to them that he would never have been in this position had someone else been the vice president. Here's a couple of quotes from him that you can find on videotape. "Gentlemen, I want to tell the truth, but I cannot tell it here. If you want a fair shake out of me, you have to take me to Washington. He appealed to Earl Warren to do that, but Earl Warren inadvisedly decided not to, even though that was easily within his authority. Another from Jack, when I mentioned about Adlai Stevenson, if he was vice president, there would never have been an assassination of our beloved President Kennedy. Asked he would explain again. Ruby continued, well, the answer is the man in office now. And they confirmed, they said the man at the top, and Ruby affirmed it. And of course, he was alluding to Lyndon Johnson. Now, this is a brilliant book by Philip Nelson, LBJ mastermind of the JFK assassination. Robert Caro had done a stunning series about the early years of Lyndon Johnson, which just reeked with information about his ruthlessness, his unquenchable ambition, his desire to be president of all the people, is willing to brook no obstacle to get that done. But when it came to turning to the assassination, Robert Caro folded for reasons I do not profess to understand. It may have been simply too much for him. But Phil Nelson picked up the issue and carried it to completion, where if you read Phil Nelson's book about LBJ's character as a young man, it really leaves you no doubt at all that he was just exactly of the appropriate mindset to force himself on the ticket in Los Angeles. Jack had actually extended the invitation to be his running mate to Stuart Symington of Missouri, but he gave him overnight to think about it. Bobby went by the Johnson suite as a formality to invite Lyndon, which, of course, they would never have imagined he would have accepted, because it would have entailed giving up his position as the powerful majority leader of the Senate. And he was startled when Lyndon jumped on the invitation. That Bobby and Jack weren't happy, because he not only wasn't on their short list, he wasn't even on their long list. But Lyndon threatened to expose that JFK had Addison's disease, was not expected to live a long, healthy life, and that he had had dalliances with beautiful women, some of whom were spies for East Germany, information Lyndon had been given by J. Edgar Hoover. In addition, he asserted that if he were not on the ticket, then any legislative proposals coming down from the White House would be dead on arrival. Bobby and Jack tried to figure a way out of it, but were unable to, and ceded to Lyndon's demands. When one of his wealthy backers heard the news that Lyndon would be running with Jack, he burst into the Johnson suite cursing and swearing, because now LBJ was going to help JFK become elected president. Bobby Baker took him into a bedroom and explained what they had in mind. He came out all smiles, and he said he thought that was an excellent plan. Bobby Baker would later assert that JFK would not survive his term, and that he would die a violent death. Another book, a more recent vintage, is by Roger Stone, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. It's a valuable book, especially because Roger Stone has been a very active political operator for the Republican Party for a very long time, and that his political sophistication lends weight to the case. So I'm very glad that Roger has published this book, as in addition to the others I've mentioned here. There were lots of concerns about the Texas connection, that ties to the Texas oilman. Craig Zerbel wrote a book about the Texas connection. E. Hewitt Howley had written one before, A Texan Looks at Lyndon. No one who is familiar with this body of evidence, written by those who knew Lyndon the best up close and personal, can have any doubt about Lyndon's pivotal role in the assassination. A recent book entitled The Devil's Chessboard by David Talbot, therefore, has caused me considerable distress, because it seeks to place the responsibility on the shoulders of Allen Dulles, who was a very good bureaucrat, but who would not have had the intestinal fortitude to undertake an operation of this kind. He was drawn into it by Lyndon himself and played his role without any doubt. But unfortunately, because it gives a misplaced emphasis on Dulles and essentially minimizes or exonerates Lyndon, I regard this as a work of disinformation. It's not the first time I've had difficulties with David Talbot. He and another prominent reporter collaborated going down to Little Havana to seek out information about David Sanchez Morales, but they made it obvious why they were there, threw around a lot of money, and it was very clear that what they were doing was actually blowing their cover, making it impossible to learn more information about David. I published on this in an article entitled "Outing the CIA at the Ambassador," which I recommend for those who want to pursue these issues further. I want to turn now to multiple proofs of the alteration of the Zapruder film, where there are those such as Josiah Thompson and Robert Groden who maintain its authenticity in spite of the mountain of evidence we're going to review here today, that in fact the film has been massively revised. In fact, John P. Costello, PhD, the leading expert on the film in the world today, describes it as a fabrication because in addition to making alterations to the frame, they had to reshoot the sequence because of the phenomenon known as the ghost panels, which you'll observe here when I play this version of the film, which is the best available, which was constructed by John Costello. He discovered that even in the MPI version, widely touted as the best available, there were frames missing, there were frames in the wrong order, and so forth. He corrected all those problems and eliminated pincushion distortion and aspect ratio distortion to provide the best version of the film we have available. I'll say more about John's work as we proceed, but let's turn to view the Zapruder film in several iterations as the most famous short video in history, and if it were only authentic, would also be perhaps among the very most important. Here, we'll take a look at the film, and I'll offer some comments about features that have been bothersome from the beginning. Now, here you see the Zapruder film where there's a huge gap. Zapruder said he began filming when the motorcade approached Elm Street, and filmed continuously until it disappeared under the triple underpass. But notice there's a huge gap there because William Greer, the driver, swung out too widely, appears to have mistaken a frontage road in front of the book depository for Elm Street, and nearly hit a concrete abutment, as Roy Truly reported. So he had to pull back and regroup, which was very embarrassing and unprofessional. So they took that out. Then, of course, if you notice in the foreground, there's a string of spectators who are virtually motionless.
They're not even reacting. They're not even reacting at all.
That's right. And the reason appears to be that was they aren't reacting like everyone else throughout the motorcade because the president wasn't present when that piece of footage was taken. It appears to have been done when the pilot car went past. And then using the techniques of optical printing and special effects, they integrated it for reasons unknown. In addition, Mary Mormon and Gene Hill, who are on the grass here, where Gene is in a red coat, Mary was taking Polaroid photographs. They both explained they stepped out into the street. Gene stepped out and called over, "Hey, Mr. President, look over here. We want to take your photograph." And Mary stepped into the street and took a photograph just an instant after he was hit in the head. Very famous photograph. But here they're shown on the grass, even though they actually were in the street. In addition, Noel Twyman was so troubled by the head turns of Greer of looking back at JFK and looking forward, he thought they occurred much too fast, so that he hired a professional tennis player to see if he could, how fast he could turn his head. And it turned out that the Greer head turns are twice as fast as is humanly possible, which may not sound like much until you realize it turns a 4-minute mile into a 2-minute mile. The back and to the left, by the way, occurred, although it wasn't a part of the original events, and no one reported seeing it because they simply edited out too many frames. And therefore, as David Mantic concluded long since, it was an artifact of the manner in which the film had been reconstructed. I'll now go through in greater detail what we know about the film and other proofs that it had indeed been edited. Now, everyone knows the official scenario has Lee Oswald firing 3 shots from the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. Here you see a lot of the building structures and locations that are particularly important. Notice on Houston Street, the County Records Building. Notice in between Houston and the book depository is the Daltex back in the corner. Then you have the book depository. Location number 2 is the low colonnade from which Zapruder purportedly took his famous motion picture. 1 is a location which is incorrect, where JFK suffered his fatal shots to the head, which actually, as I'll explain, occurred further down Elm Street. Number 3 is a location from which a grassy knoll shooter was alleged to have fired. 4 actually is a location where a key shot was fired that I will explain. 6 is a location where James Tague, a distant bystander, was injured by a shot that missed and hit the roadside curbing. 5 actually is very close to the location from which one of the shots was fired, which I will now describe in greater detail. We know on the basis of studies of the medical evidence, and especially when it's corrected to remove the discrepancies that were deliberately introduced as part of the cover-up. For example, the discovery by David W. Mantic already in December of 1992 that the autopsy x-rays had been altered to conceal a fist-sized blowout to the back of the head caused by a shot fired from in front, that a 6.5 millimeter metallic slice was added to the anterior posterior x-ray, and that other alterations were made that I shall explain. We now know that Jack was hit at least 4 times, once in the back from the top of the County Records Building. This was about 5.5 inches below the collar, just to the right of the spinal column. He was hit a second time in the throat by a shot that passed through the windshield en route to its target. Among the points I'll make in relation to setting things up by the Secret Service, they moved JFK's military aide from the front seat, where he would have been situated between Roy Kellerman, the agent in charge, and William Greer, the driver, so that that shot, had he not been moved, would have hit him instead of JFK. And then after the driver, William Greer, pulled the limousine to the left into a halt, he was hit twice in the head, once in the back of the head from the Daltex, a shot that caused him to slump forward. Jack eased him back up and was looking him right in the face when he was hit in the right temple by a frangible or exploding bullet that set up shock waves that blew his brains out the back of his already weakened cranium with such force that when they impacted with motorcycle patrolman Bobby Hargis there, he initially thought he himself had been shot. Here's the notes taken by an independent investigator in May of 26th of 1992 of Thomas Evan Robinson, who spent more time with the body than any other person. He prepared the body for a funeral and explained that in addition to a large gaping hole in the back of his head, there was a small wound in the right temple and a wound on the back 5 to 6 inches below the shoulder, just to the right of the spinal column. Notice, looking at the notes specifically, the large gaping hole in back of head, he believed it was patched by stretching a piece of rubber, and that it was filled with plaster of Paris. A small wound in the right temple, the entry wound for that blowout, but there was also a crescent-shaped flap, a skull flap, I'll explain, 3 inches approximately, that was blown out just above his ear when the bullet blew up. There were approximately 2 small shrapnel wounds in his face that were packed with wax. He discovered these when he undertook the embalming, and embalming fluid began to leak out. David Mantic quite brilliantly inferred that those had been caused by tiny shards of glass when the bullet passed through the windshield en route to hitting him in the throat. A wound in the back 5 to 6 inches below the shoulder to the right of the spinal column. The adrenaline glands and brain were removed. No other organs were removed and then put back. That there was no swelling or discoloration to the face, meaning JFK died instantly. It's very interesting that the FBI and the Secret Service both concluded there had been 3 shots with 3 hits the day of the assassination, that Jack had been hit in the back, 5 to 6 inches below the collar, that he'd been hit in the back of the head, which killed him, and that Connolly had been hit in the back. When it was later discovered that James Tague had been injured by a bullet that missed, they were forced to reconstruct the crime using only 2 trajectories, which led to the introduction of the preposterous magic bullet theory, about which I shall have more to say. If you look at this, these photographs and diagrams from the House Select Committee, who very oddly seem to have dispatched or covered up a fist-sized hole at the back of his head, about which there was no doubt, but an even larger missing back of his head that was described in detail with mathematical precision in the official autopsy report. I show you these not because they're authentic, which they clearly are not, but because they show the skull flap so clearly. You will later see the skull flap when I discovered that we could actually see the wound, the blowout to the wound, and there's a pink extension there, which is the very skull flap we're witnessing here.
Yeah, in reality, the whole back of his head was blown out on the right side of that picture.
No, that's not correct, Don. That was a description.
Well, it was okay. All right, so like from the right side, the right back quarter of his head was basically gone. That's painted on.
Here, Don, if you'll hold your horses.
Okay.
Here's the way the wound looked to the Parkland physician. It was a fist-sized blowout. We have multiple reports about the dimensions of this wound. It was first seen by Clint Hill, who observed it when he rushed up to push Jackie back when she climbed out on the trunk, going after a big chunk of Jack's skull and brains. It was a fist-sized hole. It was obvious this was fatal. He looked at it and turned and gave his colleagues a thumbs down, meaning there was no hope for him. But look at the remarkable transition from the fist-sized hole to the enlargement of the wound, which was done by Commander Humes, who actually took a cranial saw to the skull of JFK and expanded it to try to make it look more like something that had been caused by a shot from behind, where when you come to the HSCA reinvestigation, they contract all of that to a small wound at the top of the head, which is really so preposterous that it led me to call Cyril Wecht, who'd been a member of the House Medical Panel, to ask him, Cyril, I said, how did the HSC account for the enormous difference between the gigantic missing back of the head described in the official autopsy report and the contraction to a small wound at the top of the head in the HSC report? And to my consternation, he replied, I'll have to check my notes. Here is the wound to the throat before it was altered, because not only did the Commander Humes alter the back of the head using a cranial saw, which was witnessed, by the way, by 2 parties, one of whom was Thomas Evan Robinson, so that when the HSCA, when the Assassination Records Review Board deposed him, a panel of 5 civilians that were authorized to declassify documents and records from the CIA, the Secret Service, the FBI, and so forth, when in the wake of the resurgence of interest generated by Oliver Stone's film JFK, when they got to Thomas Evan Robinson and asked him about these dotted lines which were indicating the dimensions of what had been done, he said, oh no, the doctors did that because he'd actually witnessed Commander Humes use the cranial saw to perform that atrocity, really outrageous. Humes also appears to have expanded the wound to the throat to try to make it look more like a blowout. Bob Livingston, MD, a world authority on the human brain, who was also an expert on wound ballistics, had called Humes early in the day to explain to him that this wound, a small clean puncture wound, as well as a blowout to the back of the head, which had entered the right temple, had been widely broadcast on radio and television that day. He therefore called Humes, who worked across the street from where he was the scientific director of 2 of the institutes of the National Institutes of Health, and told him that therefore the neck had to be very carefully dissected because, and this is so ironic in retrospect, if there were any evidence of shots from behind, then it had to have been multiple shooters and therefore a conspiracy. Humes would feign not knowing that information until after the autopsy was completed, when he spoke with Malcolm Perry in Dallas, but of course that was simply part of an elaborate cover-up. Here you see the wound. It was a small, clean puncture wound before the tracheostomy incision on the left. On the right, after the tracheostomy incision, nothing like we'll see subsequently in a photograph where you can see how much damage was done, which appears to have been done by Humes after calling back to Dr. Livingston to ask him what the throat wound would look like if it had been a wound of accident, which Bob, of course, explained, and then Humes appears to have used that as his guide in reconstructing the wound. Here's Malcolm Perry on the right, the very talented physician who performed the tracheostomy through the small wound in the president's throat. He explained 3 times during the press conference following the announcement that the president was dead by the acting press secretary, who explained it was a simple matter of a bullet right through the head, attributing that finding to Admiral George Berkeley, the president's personal physician, that the bullet had been coming at him. This is known as the Parkland press conference, which was never presented, given to the Warren Commission, but I included it in my first collection of expert studies, which include David Manick's brilliant work on the autopsy x-rays and Bob Livingston's determination that the brain shown in diagrams and photographs could not in the National Archives could not possibly be of the brain of JFK, and where Perry, repeatedly explained it was a wound of entry. Here on the left.
One point I wanted to stick in real quick, Jim, was when Perry's press conference, he said it was a simple matter of a bullet right to the head. He pointed from down to up into the right temple.
The acting press secretary made that point. I don't recall Malcolm Perry addressing
whoever who was the guy giving the press conference?
Malcolm Kilduff.
Kilduff, yeah, that's who. Yeah.
Malcolm Kilduff was the acting press secretary who announced that JFK and pointed to his right temple, saying it was a simple matter of a bullet right through the head. But in the Perry press conference, he's talking about the wound to the throat. Most important here. If you look on the left, you'll see from the famous Altgen 6 photograph, you can actually see the bullet wound in the windshield. It's a small white spiral nebula at the location where JFK's left ear would be if his left ear were visible. But in Murder in Dealey Plaza, we have a brilliant report from Douglas Weldon, J.D., an attorney from Kalamazoo, now deceased, who actually followed up on what was done to the vehicle when it was sent back to Ford, stripped down to bare metal and rebuilt, including replacing the windshield. He found the Ford official who'd replaced it, who confirmed that it had a through-and-through bullet hole, and it was from the front to the rear. You'll see on the right, however, a third windshield, because we had the initial on the vehicle in Dallas, then we had the brand-new windshield that was used to replace it. And then the Secret Service produced yet a third, which had a spider-like fragment from a bullet fired from behind to try to support the scenario of 3 shots and only 3 shots fired from behind. It's significant to note, by the way, that the vehicle was a crime scene on wheels and could not have been subjected to reconstruction except by the orders at the highest level of government, either that of J. Edgar Hoover or Lyndon Johnson himself. In slide 225, you can actually see the bullet hole in the windshield in a frame from the Zapruder film. David Mantic was, of course, fascinated by the magic bullet theory, and as a leading expert on the medical evidence in the world today, he took a patient who had similar chest and neck dimensions to JFK and created a CAT scan, and then plotted the official trajectory of the magic bullet, which entailed moving its actual location from an already exaggerated description of his uppermost back to the base of the back of the neck, which was done by Gerald Ford in order to make the magic bullet theory more plausible. But as David determined, the trajectory isn't even anatomically possible because cervical vertebrae intervene. So it's very notable that if you look at reconstructions, whether on Discovery Channel or Nova or ABC, that when they create a stand-in for JFK in order to simulate the magic bullet trajectory, their stand-in has no spinal column, which is doubly insulting because not only did JFK have a backbone, JFK had backbone, which was, of course, the principal reason why he was taken out. I shall now review 15 indications of Secret Service complicity in setting him up. It's really stunning how obvious it becomes what was going on when you look at all the evidence. 2 agents, for example, were left behind at Love Field. Here's one by Emory Roberts, the agent in charge of the Presidential Protection Detail, who has to be fingered as one of the key players in the assassination. Here, one of them, Henry Ribka, expresses dismay at being called off. They didn't weld the manhole covers. They didn't close the open windows. Look in here. The 110th Military Intelligence Unit was ordered to stand down over the adamant opposition of its commanding officer. Here's an absolutely stunning photograph that shows how bad the security was. Notice any gunman with a handgun in that bus could have taken out the President of the United States. It would have been child's play. Look how the crowd was allowed to spill out into the street. I mean, anyone who thinks this is a serious form of presidential protection ought to go back to school, because this is simply ridiculous. In addition, the motorcycle escort was cut down to 4 who were instructed not to ride forward of the rear wheels. One of them observed it was the damnedest formation he'd ever seen. Notice we have Officer Cheney, number 9, Officer Jackson, number 10. And on the left, we have Officer Martin, number 7, and Officer Hargis, number 6. It would be Hargis who would be hit by the debris and initially believed he himself had been shot. In addition, just 4 days before the motorcade, it was changed from going straight up Main Street to get on the Stemmons Freeway to taking a deviant turn from Main Street onto Houston, and then the 110-degree turn back onto Elm. Those are violations of Secret Service protocol. They lay down a route, and they never change it. They have to check all the buildings, all the persons who might be in those buildings. They never change it. This was done on the basis of a change in the location where he would speak from the Women's Forum, which was a very good, secure location approved by the Secret Service, to the Trade Mart, which had lots of balconies and exits, very hazardous, very bad location. But it was used to justify this transformation in the motorcade route just 4 days before the event.
Yeah, Sam Bloom was behind that route change, and he got it published in the local papers as well.
And what was his explanation, Don?
Oh, he was having a big tiff with Kennedy's advance people, and yeah, like you said, they wanted it at the they didn't want it at the Women's Forum. They wanted it at the
Trade Mart.
The Trade Mart, yeah. Sam Bloom was a local businessman there in Dallas.
Thanks for the note. The most telling sign, however, is they put all the vehicles in the wrong position. The presidential limousine was placed first. Lower-ranking dignitaries, such as the mayor and the vice president, should have preceded him. Reporters were moved to the rear, and the president's personal physician to the last car, which put him in the worst location should his patient require emergency medical treatment. A flatbed truck that should have preceded the presidential limousine was canceled. This is where reporters would have ridden with their cameras to record a major political event. By putting the presidential limo out in front, of course, they made it easiest to identify the target. But in addition, the motorcade was composed of vehicles of many different makes, colors, and models, an exception to any other presidential motorcade known to history. This was deliberate so that the perps would know who was in which vehicle. At Parkland, where the moribund president was taken, a Secret Service agent took a bucket and sponge and began to clean up the blood and brains from the limousine, you notice there. Sam Kinney, through a neighbor who contacted me long after his death, claimed to have been responsible for that, saying he didn't want the president to be remembered that way. But of course, that's a ludicrous explanation, because this was a crime scene on wheels, and as forensic evidence, you want to leave it exactly in the pristine condition in which it occurred. When we turn to the study of the film in great detail, the third of the 3 volumes I have edited, where I brought together the best experts on different aspects of the cases found in the Great Zapruder film hoax. And among the findings we report there include that Roderick Ryan was consulted by Noel Twyman in the preparation of bloody treason. Why there was background was blurred in frame 302, but not in frame 303. And Ryan explained that the camera was panning the limo in 302, but not in 303, where it was stationary. On page 159, he added he'd shown it to his son, also in the film industry. He agreed it was moving in 302, but moving in 302, but standing still in 303. So we've had, evidence. In addition to that, I already reported about the film that something was terribly wrong. Notice here you have Mary and Jean on the grass, whereas I've already explained in relation to our review of the best edition or version of the Zapruder film. They actually both affirmed themselves having been in the street. Here's another report from Erwin Schwartz, who was an associate of Abraham Zapruder, who viewed the film in what appears to have been its original state at Eastman Kodak. Nearly 60 witnesses have reported the limousine slowed dramatically or came to a complete halt, as Vince Palomar explained in a chapter in Murder in Dealey Plaza 2000, the second of the 3 in the trilogy. When Noel asked him about the limo stop, he was vague and couldn't recall, but when he asked him about the effects of the fatal headshot, Schwartz was quite specific and very graphic. He said he'd seen Kennedy's head suddenly whip around to the left. He'd seen an explosion of blood and brains from the head, and it was blown to the left and rear. Noel pressed him on this crucial point, but Schwartz was emphatic. It was to the left and rear. This, of course, is something we have a great deal of confirmation for, but it's especially important to note that in relation to the hypothesis that's often ventured that William Greer actually turned and shot JFK, had Greer, who was to his left front, fired at JFK, his brains would have blown out to the right rear. Instead, they were blown out to the left. And as I have observed, when they impacted with Bobby Hargis riding there, he initially thought he himself had been shot. In addition, Secret Service, who saw the blood and brains on the limousine when it was brought back to Washington, D.C., were nauseated. It therefore became particularly important that they had to clean that indication that his brains had been blown out to the rear by a shot fired from in front. So that was one of the measures they took when they reconstituted the Zapruder film. Now, those who'd like to see a truly excellent, superb study of the technical problems with the Zapruder film, check out the JFK assassination film hoax. This is the introduction done by John P. Costello. It's absolutely brilliant. He affirms that the film is about 98% technically perfect, but in fact, it suffered from other deficiencies in relation to the other 2%, which you can find there on assassinationscience.com, which I was dumbfounded to discover. My original website is included on the list of 200 that have been released by the U.S. News and World Report as fake or secret Russian websites. This is so preposterous. I am utterly stunned that anyone would believe any of this nonsense. The sites they list, including Assassination Science, are among the best and most reliable for reporting the truth, which is why they're attempting to suppress them with idiotic claims such as these are secret Russian websites.
Where's all the Russian money that all these years that we haven't been getting?
I hope you'll have them forward the check, Don. Now, it's quite remarkable that in the Life issue of October 2nd, 1964, which included color photographs, they broke the plate for the Life magazine issue twice in order to revise description number 6. They're trying to find an artful way to indicate that this showed the direction from which the bullet had been fired had come from behind. I doubt in the history of publishing that's ever happened. Every issue of Life magazine comes off a single set of plates. And breaking them once would be extraordinary. Breaking them twice, really stunning. So I've already mentioned, the driver's head turns twice as fast as humanly possible, the all but motionless spectators. The blob and blood spray, which appear to have been painted in, as John Costello observes, they disappear in a single frame, which is far too quickly to have been real. But what this means is that Life magazine was complicit in the cover-up. Here we have the diagrams of the double hit theory that was so masterfully articulated by Josiah Thompson in his book, 6 Seconds in Dallas, published in 1966, which it made a very favorable impression upon me initially when I returned from serving in the Marine Corps in the Far East. Though today, of course, we've had many differences. I was troubled when Josiah started to disavow the most important proofs of conspiracy in his own book, which include that when you study frames 312 to 313, 14, 15, 16, there's a forward motion from 312 to 313, which is all that remains of the headshot where he was hit in the back of the head and slumped forward and Jackie eased him back up. And then after he was hit in the right temple, he slumped to the left. There was none of the jerky back into the left motion we find that's actually diagrammed here in another of this brilliant scientific part of Josiah Thompson's book, and by far the most important, which he has sought to disavow. Meanwhile, David Lifton had gone to Caltech to visit with Richard Feynman, who was the most brilliant, famous physicist in the world at the time, with a series of blow-ups of the crucial frames, and Feynman himself used a ruler to determine that JFK's head had gone forward between 312 and 313 and then back and to the left and so forth, so that David Lifton had already independently confirmed the double hit theory, even as Josiah Thompson was trying to obliterate the most important contribution he ever made to the study of the death of JFK. Here about the head wounds, we find they blacked out the head wound in early frames. They altered the x-rays to prove it did not exist. When I reviewed later frames, I found it in frame 374. Here you can see frame 317, where it's clearly been blacked out. Now, during the conference, I had the very interesting suggestion from a very smart guy that they might have taken the blowout at the back of the head and moved it there to the side to try to make it look more like something that might have been caused by a wound from behind. Very interesting suggestion I'd never encountered before. Here's frame 374, where it occurred to me that they were so preoccupied with covering up in the earlier frames, they might have overlooked that it might be visible in later frames. And here you can see it in frame 374. Notice the pink extension. That's the skull flap that I drew attention to in relation to the HSCA's fabricated photographs and diagrams of the skull wound. But notice it's a blue-gray matter. Remember, they refer to brain matter as gray matter. Well, there's a reason for that. Here's a comparison between 374 on the right and a couple of the earlier frames where it was blacked out. In fact, although they did not appear at Judah's conference here, there's a Hollywood film restoration team whose office is Sidney Wilkinson is their coordinator. I visited their studio in Hollywood. I viewed their forensic version of the Zapruder film as of extremely high quality, and they were just taken aback by the crudity with which the blowout to the back of the head had been blown out, had been painted over in black. Here's David's identification of the area on the back of the lateral cranial x-ray called area P of the blowout. Know how closely it corresponds to the roughly cashew-shaped blowout we can see in frame 374. Now, about the limousine stop, which took place, I mean, as I explained, when turning from Houston onto Elm, Greer swung out too widely. That's why we have that enormous gap where, Zapruder claimed he'd filmed from the beginning of the motorcade coming up to Elm Street till it disappeared under the triple underpass. But we have that huge gap to conceal Greer's having to bring the limo, it would appear, even to a halt to get back in line when he made a mistake. This, however, is the second limo stop further down where the fatal shots were hit, the hits to the head took place. Some who saw it slow dramatically, others saw it come to a complete stop, where it slowed dramatically as it came to a complete stop. The stop was an obvious indication of Secret Service complicity and had to be removed. Here's an interview that Deborah Conway, who in my opinion is not a seeker of truth about the assassination of JFK, did with Tony Foster, who told Deborah, for some reason the car stopped. It did stop for seconds. I don't even know why it stopped. And all of a sudden it sped up and they went under the underpass. I can never figure out why the car stopped. In this commentary about her remarks, the source says he doubts Tony had ever seen the Zapruder film, had no idea her recollections contradicted it. Very much like David Lifton's early interviews with the Newmans, who also reported the vehicle having come to a halt. Here are some other reports. Billy Lovelady, ironically, on the steps of the book depository. I recall following the shooting, I ran toward the spot where President Kennedy's car had stopped. Roy Truly, the car I saw, the president's car, swerved to the left and stopped somewhere down in this area. During his commission testimony, Bellin asked, when you saw the president's car seem to stop, how long did it appear to stop, Mr. Truly? It would be hard to say, over a second or two, something like that. I saw it stop. I don't know. I just didn't see it start up. And indeed, it will turn out the interval during which it was motionless was considerably greater in duration. Mrs. Earl Cabell, 4 vehicles behind. I was aware that the motorcade stopped dead still. There was no question about that. Later, as I told you, the motorcade was stopped. Mr. Hubert trying to evade the implications of her remark. That was when your car, at least, had come to a standstill, Mrs. Cabell. Every car in the motorcade had come to a standstill. Later, we were dead still for a matter of some seconds. Now, more about the head wound. Even Clint Hill confirmed a fist-sized blowout at the back of the head. It can be seen defined by Jackie's white glove in crucial frames following 313, a discovery of Larry Rivera, quite ingenious indeed, where the x-rays were altered to complement blacking out the wound in early frames. During a presentation at Warwick's bookstore, I believe in San Diego, Clint Hill repeated for the umpteenth time how he rushed out to the vehicle, pushed Jackie back, lay across their bodies, and peered into this fist-sized blowout at the back of his head, then turned and gave his colleagues a thumbs down. Of course, he's been saying this for over 50 years in written and other verbal presentations. Here we find that while they use the Zapruder as a guideline to alter the others, where there are as many as 8, and the Zapruder and the Nix being the most important because they cover the most of the assassination. Nix taken from the opposite side. Notice in the Nix on the left that Jackie goes further back on the trunk than we see in the Zapruder. And clearly, the Zapruder is not only internally inconsistent because you cannot see the blowout in early frames. It's been painted over, but you can see the blowout in later frames. But the Nix film and the Zapruder are not consistent between them. In addition, even if Clint actually touched Jackie, the films don't show him pushing her into the seat, which he's maintained for all these years. In his formal report, he stated, as I lay over the top of the back seat, I noticed a portion of the president's head on the right rear side was missing. He was bleeding profusely. Part of his brain was gone. I saw a part of his skull with a hair on it. If you go down, it's fascinating. This is consistent with frame 374, not 313 through 316. But even the Kennedy Detail, a recent book, 2010, about the assassination and the Secret Service performance, and slumped across the seat. President Kennedy lay unmoving, a bloody, gaping fist-sized hole clearly visible in the back of his head. An observation of enormous significance in relation to the autopsy photographs and x-rays, as well as the authenticity of the Zapruder film. Here you can see Jackie climbing back, but the point is this is frame 374, 375. It may be they were looking at Jackie in relation to Clint and overlooked that you can see the blowout in the president's head there in both of those frames. Now, Larry Rivera discovered that in earlier frames, Jackie's glove provides a background against which the defect becomes visible. And you can see it's massive indeed. There you can see the skull flap, which may instead have been, therefore, the source of what seemed to be the blob that was suggested moving the blowout to the back of the head because there was such a skull flap. Here, Larry points out the difference between her right hand and her left hand, which is providing a background. Indeed, here's a more specific diagram or outline of the dimensions of the wound in relation to her glove. I mean, how fortuitous, how serendipitous that this should have been captured, that Larry should have noticed. Here another, you can see Finally, here you can see frame 343 blowout 3D enhanced with Blender, where Larry's doing brilliant work using this new 3D methodology. And here you see a blowout with Blender. Look at the enormity of the cavity in the center of that Blender image. We also have many other proofs that are less intrinsically significant, but that demonstrate without any doubt that the Zapruder film was redone. Here's comparisons of photographs of the location and dimensions of the Zapruder freeway sign, which revealed it was replaced by misplaced images. Although not as important as others, it demonstrates the extent of the revision. You see, there's a photograph of the actual location of the sign, but notice where it was in place in the film. Here's another, here's another, here's another. Here, if you watch this GIF, you can see how much difference there is from the actual location of the Zapruder film. Another proof that this was massively revised. In terms of the actual assassination scenario, as we already know, Jack was hit at least 4 times. There were at least, it turns out, 6 shooters who fired from 8 to 10 shots, possibly more. Here, just to recount the locations of Martin and Hargis and Jackson and Cheney, where we've now established that Lee was in the doorway in the background there. The actual scenario was on this order, that the shot to the back was fired, the green line from the top of the Dallas County Records building. It appears by Deputy Sheriff Harry Weatherford, who used a .30-06 to fire a Mannlicher Carcano bullet to implant such a bullet in the back of JFK using a plastic collar known as a sabot. He appears to have fired yet a second shot, which was really inadvisable, that was created a mark by the manhole cover in the grass there. The bottom left, the blue line indicates the shot fired from what is actually inside the triple underpass. So that location is at fault now, where Larry and I and Gary went to the Dealey Plaza inside the underpass and found the perfect location. But that's a blue line that passed through the windshield and hit JFK in the throat. Then we have the yellow lines are 3 shots that were fired from the, that shot, by the way, appears to have been fired by an Air Force expert by the name of Jack Lawrence, who went to work for the automobile dealership that provided all the vehicles just a few days before, and then wound up back there all muddy, nauseated, and vomiting over what he had just done. From the Dow Tex, we had a anti-Castro Cuban by the name of Nestor Tony Escadro using a Mannlicher Carcano, the only unsilenced weapon, to fire 3 shots. The reliability of the weapon is so great, where it was known in World War II as a humanitarian rifle for never actually harming anyone in purpose, is that it scored 2 misses, even with what would have been relatively straightforward shots, one of which hit the distant curbing and injured James Tague, another of which hit the chrome strip over the windshield limousine, the third of which, however, hit JFK in the back of the head, causing him to slump forward. A shot from the grassy knoll is shown in red. Now, that appears to have been fired by a Dallas police officer tied to the CIA, Roscoe White. But it appears that from the angle, he would have harmed Jackie. They were under strict instructions she should not suffer any harm. So he appears to have pulled his shot. The round was actually found in the grass, picked up by a lieutenant. The orange are indications from the opposite side of the book depository, where Malcolm Mac Wallace appears to have been firing bullets at John Connally in the mistaken belief that it was Ralph Yarborough, liberal Texas senator whom Lyndon despised. In fact, Lyndon had a huge argument with JFK that morning, trying to get Connally out and Yarborough in, but JFK overrode him on the ground that the chief executive of the state should ride with the chief executive of the United States. So there wasn't time to notify the shooters, and Connally suffered several wounds from as many as 3 shots fired at him, which actually obfuscated the politics, because no one would have believed that Lyndon would set up his chief henchman, who'd been his campaign manager in 1960, for shooting. Then from the left, finally, we have the shot fired that entered the right temple, the frangible exploding bullet, by Frank Sturgis, who is a soldier of fortune. Jim Rothstein, a New York Gold Shield detective, arrested him coming to the apartment of Marita Lorenz to murder her so she couldn't testify to the HSCA. And during the conversation they had, Rothstein used the throwaway line, "nice shooting." And Sturgis admitted he'd shot JFK. He said he did it because he had betrayed the brigade at the Bay of Pigs and because he was cavorting with beautiful women who were spies for foreign countries, and that he'd aimed for his eye, but that JFK had moved slightly, so he'd hit him in the temple instead. The limo stop scenario is far more elaborate. During the limo stop, we know he was hit at least twice as recounted, but in addition, Larry Rivera discovered after recovering the interviews that were done of the 4 motorcycle escort officers by an associate of Fred Newcomb, as well as their supervisor, Stavis Ellis, that Officer Baker had dismounted his bike and run between the cars to the grassy knoll, which he could not have done had they not been stationary. That Officer Jackson rode his bike up the grassy knoll, and 5 Secret Service agents surrounded the presidential limousine. One took a piece of skull from a little boy and threw it in the back seat. The actual shooting, David Manning.
Excuse me, Jim. That would be Officer Hargis, who dismounted and ran in front of the, in between the limos.
Oh, yeah. Did I say Baker?
Yes.
Yeah, Marion Baker was on the opposite side and would rush into the book depository to confront Lee Oswald in the coke room. I think he was actually assigned to shoot him, but Roy Truly was there, and it wouldn't have looked plausible. Absolutely, yes. It was Officer Hargis who, after having been hit so hard with the debris that he thought he himself had been shot, parked his bike, dismounted, and ran between the 2 vehicles, which he could not have done had they not been stationary. David and I were both astonished when Newsweek 22 November 1993 published this photograph showing the fatal shot to the head at the location where it appears to have taken place, as you can see further down Elm Street. Here is a frame from the Knicks to try to give you a bit of an idea about the relative location, but it's not right because it's been so massively edited. Here I sought to do a reconstruction based upon Larry's arduous transcription of the interviews that had been done with the motorcycle officers. Here's a sketch of where you had Hargis parking his bike and running between the limos, Jackson motoring up, 5 Secret Service agents surrounding the JFK limo. Here I integrate them here. It's rather crude, and we're anticipating putting together a full-blown visual treatment of what actually happened during the assassination. Here is one of the officers running toward, and you look just above his head, you can see marks in the grass that are indicative of the Jackson having rode his motorcycle up. Here are others where you can see them even more clearly, frames from the Bell film. Look at all those tracks from the motorcycle. It turns out that the Oklahoma City Times even published a paragraph about it. A motorcycle patrolman rode pell-mell up a railroad embankment, apparently in pursuit of the assassin. That, of course, came to be known as the Grassy Knoll. Here we have 2 videos, YouTube, about Larry's research, the JFK Horseman Part 1, the JFK Horseman Part 2, as an overview of what we understand. The authenticity of the film has been among the most contentious issues in JFK research, but there's a mountain of proof. It's a reconstruction. Even notable figures such as Josiah Thompson and Groden persist in insisting it's authentic when it's not even internally consistent. We know the original 8mm all-ray split film developed in Dallas was taken to the National Photographic Interpretation Center on Saturday the 23rd, and that the substitute 16mm unsplit film developed in Rochester at a secret CIA photo lab known as Hawkeye Works adjacent to Kodak headquarters was taken there on Sunday the 24th, where 2 different teams worked on the 2 different versions and where the substitution was effected. We also know a half a dozen or more have viewed another film, apparently the original, including William Raymond, Rich De La Rosa, Gregory Burnham, and several others, where Rich De La Rosa's description of its content appears as an appendix to the Great Zapruder film hoax. Jack White raised many questions about whether Zapruder, shown here with his secretary, Marilyn Seitzman, could actually have filmed the film that bears his name. Here's one of the reasons. She appears to be blocking his ability to take the film. And indeed, Jack was spot on. The film was processed in a laboratory. no one took a film that was processed in a laboratory, produced synthetically. So he's absolutely right. And I've written about this under the heading of Did Zapruder film the Zapruder film, to which the answer is emphatically no. Just as a couple of side issues, we've had this great debate over Donald Trump's suggestion that Rafael Cruz, the father of Senator Ted, was in New Orleans in front of the Trade Mart with Lee Oswald. The figure to the lower right there is actually Chauncey Marvin Holt, who prepared 15 sets of forged Secret Service credentials for use in and around Dealey Plaza. He said everyone there in this photograph was a part of Operation Mongoose. We have further confirmation that it was indeed Rafael Cruz, because he also showed up on the cover of the first of my volumes, Assassination Science, in the upper right-hand corner, to my astonishment, in the company of Antonio Veciana, who is the founder of Alpha 66, which is among the most vicious of all the JFK anti-Castro groups. It's preposterous to suppose Rafael Cruz would have been at the Trade Mart on that key occasion and also been on Main Street just before the assassination and not been on the fringe of the assassination. Here are some of the photographs. The upper left is the first where I identified George H.W. Bush standing in front of the book depository. The photograph was in Jesse Curry's JFK assassination file. I have no doubt whatsoever that that is George Herbert Walker Bush. We have another photograph of Bush where Lansdale is waiting to speak to him, and remarkably enough, we have a photograph where Lansdale is walking past the three tramps. Because of his distinctive height, weight, gait, hand, and the ring, he was identified exactly by Fletcher Prouty and by Victor Krulak, one of the most distinguished of all American Marine Corps generals in history. You can find more about the assassination and murder in Dealey Plaza, which is a synoptic overview of the assassination, includes 3 chapters by David Manick that are completely brilliant. His first on the medical evidence is the most stunning synthesis of diverse evidence I've ever witnessed in my life. And for those who would like more, to learn more about how I became involved in all of this, check out Why I, Jim Fetzer, Am a Conspiracy Theorist, where now I have a new show entitled The Conspiracy Guy on Progressive Radio Network, PRN.FM, Wednesdays from 9 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you all for this opportunity to address the issues.
Coup d'etat in slow motion, connecting the dots between the assassinations of Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme, JFK, Robert Kennedy, and John Lennon. Now available on Amazon and lightonconspiracies.com. Coup d'etat in slow motion.